Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it's Wednesday morning, and it's time once again for Ask Chuck Dixon. I happen to be Chuck Dixon, and this is where I answer your questions about what it is I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Hey, are you checking out My Sister Suprema on ArcTunes? You should. We're starting to go into print editions, but you can read the comic digitally for free at ArcTunes, and it is rising in popularity. It's a funny story. It's a sibling rivalry comedy set in a new superhero universe, and I write it, and Anthony Gonzalez Clark makes it work. He's a terrific artist. I had this idea years and years ago, but could never find the right artist for it. And Anthony just kills it every episode. So you really should be checking out what he's doing over at ArcTunes on My Sister Suprema. Tim Gilpin, Paramount's apparently bringing back the G.I. Joe franchise as a tie-in with the Transformer universe. I am skeptical the idea will work because of Transformer fatigue and the studio's past failures with the Joes. Do you agree, or are you willing to give Paramount the benefit of the doubt? I'm willing to give anybody the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I don't want to judge something till I've seen it, even though movie releases over the last 10 years or so have been one crap fest after another. You never know. The right creative team, the right cast, the right storyline might just pull this out. And as you know, I am a total sucker for crossovers. So I'll be checking this out just to see how they handle the interaction between these two franchises. Now, as far as Transformers fatigue, I think there's a fatigue generally with these big blockbuster popcorn comic booky movies. I think that cycle is over. It's certainly over in the international box office, which used to be where these things made their money. But you can't say that these movies are necessarily failures because even while they underperform at the box office, they sell a lot of merch. And I got to think that a G.I. Joe Transformers crossover is something Hasbro is going to exploit on the toy line end. So, who knows? I mean, I remember looking at the box office for the last G.I. Joe movie, and yeah, it was a bit disappointing, but on the merch end, they made almost $1 billion. So you got to look at these things the same way as the G.I. Joe and Transformers TV shows. These are basically toy commercials you're watching. Maybe highly entertaining toy commercials, but that's what they are. So, let's wait and see. Sean Fraser, you mentioned not caring very much for the fantasy genre. Isn't Conan part of the fantasy swords and sorcery genre? Help me square this circle. And do you have any recommendations on how to make the fantasy genre more interesting for guys like yourself? I think Conan is an exception. For me anyway. It's heroic fantasy, and it's not medieval fairy tale tinged fantasy with elves and dwarves and things like that, like Tolkien's work is. And I've said before, I really like Tolkien's works, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I like them so much, I kind of think they're the last word on the subject. In The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, I got all the medieval fantasy I wanted. I didn't want any more. Now, Conan, it's heroic fantasy, and it's not set in a mythical world. It's set in an imagined world that occurred between the two ice ages. Howard is careful to place his stories in a historical context, imagining that these things could have happened in a world destroyed by glacial movement, a world buried by time. A period, and the thing is, this is one of the reasons that Conan always fascinated me, other than the fact that it's about a big badass guy, fighting monsters and saving damsels in distress. I mean, that's all a given. that's going to appeal to an adolescent boy, which is when I was reading these things. This stuff was like written for me. But also it keyed into something that I had been fascinated with since I was a child, and that was the prehistory of the human race, which is a lot longer than people give credit for. There's an awful lot of the period, and I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years of man's existence on this planet that we know nothing about. And obviously Howard was fascinated by that as well and tried to fill it in. I do the same thing in my Bad Times books. I go back to 100,000 or more years in human history and sort of present what I think could have or might have been the environment at that time. And that's much what Howard does. The other thing is for me, the attraction for me is the emphasis on, warfare and violence and, typical heroic fantasy stuff. They were Greek and Roman mythology stuff, a Hercules story, but set more grounded in reality, more set in a world that we can relate to. And that's what separates Conan for me from standard fantasy fare. And as far as fantasy goes, I mean, the only fantasy I read other than Tolkien was Howard. I also read Carl Edward Wagner's Kane and a couple of other, sword and sorcery entries, because they seem to me, they appealed to me more. Once you start introducing, elves and walking trees and stuff like that, well, now you're treading on Tolkien's turf. And, like I said, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were enough for me. By the way, Siege of the Black Citadel, my first Conan novel, my first of 3 written so far. I'm fooling around with the plot for a 4th one. I'll probably end up writing that. But available now at Amazon, or you can go to Archaven. If you go to Archaven with the paperback, you get a free ebook. Drew Geraci, my buddy Drew. I know you're a huge fan of Fantastic Four. Who isn't? Nobody I want to know. So far, Hollywood has failed to give us a convincing thing. It seems Ben Grimm is a character that can only thrive in comic art. Roger Corman, the FF 2005, and the last movie that made him look thuggish instead of heroic. Is it possible to make such a cartoonish character translate to the big screen? Well, like I said with the G.I. Joe Transformer question, with the right creators, you can do anything. They don't call it movie magic for nothing. Certainly, Ben Grimm is sympathetic and relatable enough as a character. The inherent tragedy of him being turned into this, misshapen monster, and his indefatigable personality, and his blue collar background. He's just a great character. Everybody loves Ben Grimm. He's invariably everyone's favorite character in the Fantastic Four comic. So there's a lot to work with there, and the right creative team could work wonders with it. I mean, after all, who would have predicted that another Kirby character created long ago would, become so popular on the screen? I never thought Groot, would ever amount to anything, and yet the Groot merchandising and all the rest of it is practically a cottage industry, and he's seen by many as their favorite character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So even with just one line of dialogue, he won everybody over. So the proper treatment of the character, like Ben Grimm, could certainly succeed. But it seems less and less likely as these movies seem to be made by people who are seem radically opposed to simply entertaining us. J.P. Rocca, for an inspiring writer, I think you mean aspiring. What are common writing issues to avoid? Also, would you be able to talk about some common comic book writing styles? There's a lot of things to avoid. Look up Elmore Leonard. This is available anywhere. Just put in Elmore Leonard and list of 10 or 10 things or whatever. And Elmore Leonard gives 10 words of advice to writers that they're all pretty good. Like avoiding adjectives, avoiding adverbs, not writing the parts that people are going to skip, things like that. And, these are rules that he set down for himself. You don't necessarily have to follow them. I don't follow every one of Elmore Leonard's rules. But, things to avoid is, on a practical side, is working for spec. If someone asks you to work for free, it's like, yeah, it means they don't have any money. It doesn't mean they're trying you out or you're auditioning. It just means they don't have any money. Try to get a literary agent. I say try. I've never been able to. Literary agents apparently open a lot of doors for people based on what their network is like. But I've been turned down by every literary agent I've ever approached. It hasn't stopped me from writing, hasn't stopped me from selling books, and hasn't stopped me from realizing that maybe I didn't need a literary agent, but things are different now. You can write a book. That's easy. Can you sell a book? That's hard. I read some disheartening stuff today about the publishing. And did you know that there are 3,800 on average new books appear on the publishing lists every day? Wow. I mean, that just cuts you off at the ankles. That's the competition you're up against. 3,800. Now, undeniably, 99% of them are pure junk. and the thing is, that number is going to go up with AI. With AI, any simpleton can write a book in an afternoon. Will anybody want to read it? No. But it won't matter to them. And they're just going to add to the pile this huge heap of detritus of, written word crap. It's just getting higher and higher and higher. I realize that you are aspiring, and I am not inspiring at this point. But what I'm going to say is, write your story the way you want to write it. If you have a story, if you're burning to tell a story, and then you are a real writer. So just write your story and don't worry about where it's going to sell or who's going to look at it or what anybody thinks. You owe nothing to anybody except yourself to get that story down on paper. Get that story out of your system and tell it, and do all the hard work, the fighting through the middle passage of a story. Getting your ideas across, figuring out how to make it all work, plot structure, characterization, all the rest of it. And, once you're in that zone, it's heaven. Once things are rolling and things are going good and your imagination is all juiced up, it's a great place to be. So don't let me discourage you. I don't mean to discourage you. I'm just telling you the odds and what you're up against for selling. I realize you didn't ask me how to sell a book, but it's so much of what I have to do, what any creative person has to do. We have to be our own marketing departments, which is tedious. I don't like the marketing aspect of it. I want somebody else to do that. I want somebody else to tell people how wonderful I am, because I don't like telling people how wonderful I am, largely because I'm not real sure how wonderful I am. I have a lot of confidence in that area. I have confidence that my stories are entertaining and enjoyable and everything else, but not enough to I don't know how authors do book tours and things like that, where you're spending all day talking about how wonderful you are. I've never been able to do that. Now, as far as comic book writing styles, there's Marvel style, what they call Marvel style, which is really Lee and Kirby style, where you write a plot and then you leave everything else up to the artist. And to me, it seems like a really lazy way of writing. Lee and Kirby and Ditko and Lee came up with it as a way to keep up with the demand for content as Marvel expanded its line. There's no way Stan Lee could write 15, 16, 20 books a month. And so he really needed to rely on his artists to do all the heavy lifting as far as storytelling and often plot, characterization, and all the rest of it. I mean, Kirby and Ditko in particular, let's face it, they wrote their stories. Stan then applied dialogue to them. And this is a way they worked out of working so that Stan could keep up. with the demand for new material. The other way is what you see right here, which is full script. Now, this script form is the one I use. I got from Robert Kanigher. Robert Kanigher, extremely prolific writer at DC Comics. He gave me a script back in the 70s. It was the first time I ever seen a comic script. I didn't know how comics were written. Nobody was there to tell you how comics were written. And he gave me this script, and I follow his script form religiously. And artists like it, and letterers like it. It's very, very simple. It's broken down by page, by panel. The dialogue is in all caps because that's how it will appear in the comic. So why not? And it's very simple to read, very easy to read, very flexible for the artist. There's room for interpretation here and all the rest of it. So this is the form I use. This is what my full scripts look like. Not every person's full scripts look this way. As far as style, you got to find your own style. Do you want to, do you want to write a director's script where you're directing everything the artist does? Or do you want to leave it more up to the artist? Whatever. There's also hybrids of the Marvel style. I've written hybrids of the Marvel style for Johnny Romita Jr. and Joe Kubert because they didn't want to work full script. I wrote a hybrid style which had the plot broken down for them in stages and much of the dialogue so that I could get my gags in. So they understood the drama of each sequence so that I didn't get artwork back that I had no idea what the people were saying and have to make up dialogue later. Maybe Stan liked working that way. I don't like working that way. And in both cases, Johnny and Joe appreciated it because they had the dialogue, they understood how to break down the panels a little bit better. They understood what was important in the scene to get across emotionally and exposition-wise. So the other word of advice I give every comic book writer is that when writing panel descriptions, tell the artist exactly what you want. You're not bossing him around or anything else. You're giving him the information he needs to tell the story that you've written. This is how you work together. This is part of collaboration. Don't be wishy-washy. Don't leave a lot up to the artist to guess, because you're going to come out with a less than perfect final effort because your story spine isn't there, or there might be details that were important in the story the artist didn't realize were important because you failed to emphasize them or were reluctant to emphasize them because you didn't want to tell the artist what to do all the time. The artist wants your direction. Trust me. You're not insulting his intelligence. You're not insulting his abilities. He wants and needs your direction to tell the story you wrote so the two of you together can present that story with clarity and drama and or humor or whatever all the rest of it is. And if the artist is confident, if he understands the story fully as you tell it to him, he'll be able to do his best work and be able to bring stuff to the story that maybe you didn't think of. And that's really a beautiful thing when you're writing comics and an artist comes back with stuff that you didn't think of or that really enhances what you've written. And that's him making the story his as well as yours. So you're both pulling an oar, basically. You're both pulling your own weight on the story and really bringing something to the property. And that's when it clicks. That's when it's great. That's when comics are at their best. Is two people working toward the same end, which is creating a quality, entertaining, engaging story. I'm going to call this Kenny Todd Wants to Know. Kenny's got a lot of questions about the Punisher. Obviously a big Punisher fan, and we're going to jump right in here. How did you get the job writing the Punisher? I know next to nothing about Don Daley. What can you tell us about him? Was he good to work for? Reading the letters column, he seems like a no-nonsense guy. Well, I don't think anybody has ever said that Don Daley was a no-nonsense guy. I love Don Daley. I loved working with Don Daley. A lot of people didn't, because Don was a bit of a character. He wasn't like any other editor I'd ever worked for. And as far as being a no-nonsense guy, he's one of the silliest guys I've ever worked for. Also, he was hysterically funny, especially when he didn't mean to be. He was much like Frank Castle. He was really funny when he's being serious. But I really liked working for Don. Now, how did I get the Punisher? The Punisher and Conan the Barbarian are the only two characters I've ever solicited to write, that I've ever pestered editors, let them know, hey, I really want to write this character. I really want to do this. I mean, a lot of other stuff I was simply assigned. You know, I was assigned Green Arrow. You know, I was assigned Moon Knight. But Punisher and Conan, I really wanted to work on them. I really had an affinity for those characters. I liked those characters a lot. And I wanted to go to work. And I pestered Don Daley enough that eventually he, gave me a couple of inventory issues to write. And then from there, he just, if you look at my Punisher work, there's long spaces of time where there's no Punisher story for me. There's one here, and a few months later, another one, a few months later, another one. And then I sort of like eased on into the Punisher offices and became the regular Punisher writer. I became the go-to Punisher guy. And I had a great relationship with Don. He was, he knew how to challenge me. He knew how to come up with the craziest ideas for stories. Half of them I just had to say no to because they were too nuts. But he would listen to me if I wanted a particular artist on a story. He would let me get involved in that end of it. A lot of editors wouldn't let you do that. They didn't want you bringing artists to them. They didn't want you suggesting teams. But Don was wide open to it. I would say, well, I want to work with this guy and this inker together. I think it would really work. It would really click. And I was never wrong. I mean, I never brought in people that couldn't meet a deadline or were deadbeats or lacked talent. I never brought him anybody just to do a favor for an artist. I mean, I was always about what would be best for the comic. And so I end up on Punisher getting to work with my friends, Gary Quapis, Todd Fox, Flint Henry, and others. And, and that simply was unheard of for the most part with the other editors. I mean, they wanted to run the show. You were just a cog in the machine. But Don treated me like a real partner, like we were equals to create the best Punisher stories we could. And he really got the Punisher. He really understood the Punisher. I remember he called me. He'd gone to see the movie Leon, and he called me when he got home. I mean, I get this call at night. I would get calls all the time from Don. Don was the editor who was always calling me. And he called me just to tell me that the movie reminded him of a Punisher story I might have written. He says it had a lot of things in there that you would have done, which I hadn't seen the movie yet, so I didn't know what he was talking about. But, high compliment. But I'll tell you about Don calling. Don would call all the time. And he called one time when my wife was pregnant with our first child, and I was going to take a month off. And I was way ahead on all my deadlines, so I could easily just take a month off. And Don called the day that I was taking my wife to the hospital to deliver the baby. And I pick up the phone, it's Don, and he says, look, Chuck, I got this Punisher idea I want to talk to you about. And I said, Don, I told you, I'm taking the next month off. I'm taking the next 30 days off. My wife's having a baby. I want to be home with the baby. I want to help her, blah, blah, blah. And Don says, oh, she's having the baby today? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, oh, okay, I'll call you back tomorrow. I said, no, Don, don't call back tomorrow. I'll talk to you in a month. But that was Don. Don was a little bit more about Don later. The only time Don disappointed me, the only time I ever got angry at Don is when he agreed to the Punisher meets Archie crossover. I was so angry because I called him when I found out about it, and I said, look, I've been pushing for a Punisher Batman crossover for years, for like 2 years now. And so the Punisher's first crossover is with Archie. I mean, if we ever get to do Punisher meets Batman, it's going to be laughable because, this has set the tone for Punisher crossovers. And he just palmed me off. Don was good at getting out of things. Yeah, more on that later. He was a silver-tongued devil, that Don. Okay, another question from Kenny Todd about the Punisher. I noticed when I read them, they were random issues at first, like when I first got on the Punisher. Was there a reason or just the way the chips fell? One thing I enjoyed in the single issue stories, those being the cabbie story, the train in Canada, I think, and the rich guy whose wife is being held hostage, was that the female characters are not stereotypical damsels in distress. In one instance, they were the villain. It was a nice change because as reading them, I thought A was going to happen with them, and instead B happened. Very nice. Well, that's kind of my job as a writer, is to defy your expectations, to make you think the story's going one way and it's really not. Because if stories just sort of roll down the tracks in a predictable way, they're boring. You want to shake things up. Now, you don't want to shake things up to the point where you've broken the franchise or you've defied the expectations of the reader. But you do want to go beyond the expectations of the reader. So so in my Punisher stories, I wanted to present the Punisher as he was, but, throw in all kinds of complications. The Punisher almost invariably, to my mind, was always involved in deconstructed plot lines. Those are plot lines where everything's set in motion and seems to, it's going to go down this track, and then everything goes wrong. Everything falls apart. In your typical heist movie, if you ever see a movie about guys, they're going to rob a bank or they're going to break into a vault or whatever, Mission Impossible movies are a good example of this. And they have a plan, and we all know what they're going to do, and then everything goes wrong. And there are constant complications, and that's where the suspense and the thrills come from, because now they've got to think on their feet. Success is not assured. Nothing is going the way they planned. And that's a deconstructed plot line. And every Punisher story should be that, because Punisher is an agent of chaos himself, and things should never go easy for him. If things are going easy for your hero, you've failed. An example would be A Few Good Men, a movie I absolutely loathe. And at the end of the movie, we're reaching the climax. Tom Cruise basically his character lays out how he's going to win this case. And that's by getting Jack Nicholson mad on the stand. And then what happens? He gets Jack Nicholson mad on the stand. There's no deconstruction. The only possible deconstruction, and the author didn't see it that way, the filmmakers didn't see it that way, but audiences saw it that way. The only possible deconstruction is that Jack Nicholson is relatable, sympathetic, and making a case for himself. The filmmakers didn't see it that way. They thought that audiences would be horrified by what Jack Nicholson was saying, rather than sort of nodding along going, he's right. So that's an example of an undeconstructed plot line where everything just goes just the way the hero planned. And that don't work. So yeah, that's the heavy lifting for a writer, is to come up with stories that fit the formula, fit the format, fit the template, and yet jink it a little, change it up so there are surprises that don't break everything, that they're the illusion of change. Oh, Kenny gets another Punisher question. The War Zone, that was a great title. How did that come about? How did you get JR? He was perfect to draw Frank. I love Rosalie. What was her ultimate fate going to be if you had had your way? She had more lives than a cat. How close did you and JR work on it? Why did he leave? He did a lot of covers. Did he not want to leave? How come only the 11 issues and 2 annuals? Did you finish your story? Were there a lot of moments during your issues where I was reading where I would say, oh shit, out loud? Oh, I love that. Those are the great stories, in my opinion. They are few and far between these days. Warzone happened because of enhanced covers and number ones. there was this big speculator market in the early 90s, and everybody was trying to scramble to come up with a reason to do a new #1 of established characters. Don Daley put forward, hey, let's do a #1 of the Punisher, and it'll have this super duper cutout enhanced cover, and it'll sell like gangbusters. And it did. It did. It was I almost fainted when I got the royalty check. It was the biggest royalty check I'd ever gotten to that point off of Punisher Warzone #1. And so that's really how it came about. It was strictly as a marketing ploy. Now, because it was going to be promoted big and expected to sell big, it was easy to talk JR into coming on board. He always wanted to do a Punisher story. And he came on, and yes, he was quite involved. He showed up for one of the story meetings. We had a couple of meetings to plot out the story. He showed up, and one of the things he wanted to emphasize was that he wanted to emphasize, because he was Italian himself, that Frank was an Italian American, and I was fine with that. And so that's how the idea of Frank, becoming Johnny Castle or Johnny Tower, I think, was it Johnny Tower? Well, anyway, some variation on his name. I can't remember. Sorry, fans. So that was the impetus for making it a mafia story, Italian mafia story, and really leaning into Frank's Italian heritage for the story. The other thing that JR wanted was the inclusion of this character he had created, Junior Walker, a character named Shotgun, a tough, badass character, like right out of a black exploitation movie from the 70s. And I was cool with that too. Big fan of that genre myself. And so from there, we began to build this story. Once everything was in place to Johnny's satisfaction, and he didn't come to any more of the story meetings, he was happy with what was being produced. His other input was, as I had said earlier, was that he wanted to work Marvel style, which I was fine with as long as I got to include a lot of dialogue in the plot. And he was cool with that, and told me a few times that he really, really enjoyed that sort of hybrid full script plot format. And I was happy with the end results because, he did some stuff storytelling wise I never would have thought of to suggest. So he was free to, use his imagination to its fullest extent on the storytelling end. Now, why did he leave? Johnny was pistol hot as an artist. His work sold. If he did a cover, it sold more. If he did the interiors, it sold even more. So he was constantly in demand. And the powers that be at Marvel didn't want him to stay on the Punisher. And he was going to do the first 12 issues. And they just didn't want him to stay on that because they thought that he was better utilized somewhere else to sell more books, to make more money for them. So Johnny was under constant pressure to drop the Punisher and go elsewhere. And eventually he did. He succumbed to the pressure. Not to say he wasn't his own man or anything else, but, he was very much a Marvel guy, and he wanted to help out. And of course, early 1990s was a gold rush, and there was an awful lot of money to be made in comics. And Johnny was going to, help out Marvel, help out himself too. I mean, sales began to fall on Punisher Warzone, and who could blame the guy? He could make a lot more money moving over to a next title or something else. And so that's where he went, and that's why he left. Did I get to complete the story that I meant to tell with Johnny? Yes. Was it completed to my satisfaction? No, because I really missed having Johnny on the book. I really would have preferred if he stayed for the 12 issues, but I understand. It's a business. He's a professional. He's got to make decisions that he's got to make for his own career and his own work schedule and all the rest of it. So I dug it, but I got to work with him, and we did. Those first 6 issues are epic. They're indelible, and it couldn't happen without him. And of course, I got to work with him once again on Punisher Batman. So, wow, what a job he did on that, right? I mean, so cool stuff all around. Hey, Kenny Todd, he wants to know more about the Punisher. We're going to dig deeper here. In the issue 10-1, where multiple stories were happening all at once and in the span of 10 minutes, was that hard to write? Did you write out each story and then break it up to fit? How does that work? It was a very tense issue. I loved it. Yeah, the gimmick is that the entire issue takes place in the 10 minutes from, 12:50 at night to 1 in the morning. And partly inspired by the story 10 Minutes, the Spirit Story 10 Minutes by Will Eisner, which blew me away when I read it when I was like 13, 14 years old. I wanted to do that kind of story. And also I was getting to do these like single issue stories with my buddy Todd Fox. And Todd is such a terrific storyteller that, he really ate up a challenge like this. It was a challenge for me to write, a challenge for him to draw and make sense of. But the point is that when you have a story like this, it's kind of a collision course story. You have to make sure that all of the concurrent stories running that meet at the end and all of the characters in them are compelling and engaging and everything else. You can't drop the ball on any aspect of it. You can't let the gimmick take over the story. You actually have to have a story. For example, the movie Memento, which everybody, I know so many people have this like high regard for Memento, Christopher Nolan's first big feature film. And I watched it and it's like, yeah, it's a good gimmick. The guy's got short-term memory loss and basically has to solve the mystery of where he's been and everything else. But it's like, it wasn't new. I mean, amnesia as a story device is like the oldest one in the book. I mean, everything from film noir to Gilligan's Island episodes relied on amnesia as a gimmick. So nothing about that was new. And the biggest problem I had with Memento is that the story that basically he works backwards in his life to figure out how he's gotten to where he is. And the story told backwards should have been as engaging as if it were told forwards. And it wasn't. There was nothing that interesting about the story that he was uncovering. So if you're going to have a gimmick, the gimmick isn't enough. It's like if you're going to have 3D or smell-o-vision, you still need a story. So that was the heavy lifting on 10-1 was, yeah, it's a cool idea to have a comic book story takes place in 10 minutes. But what happens is more important than how it was presented. Hey, Kenny's just endlessly curious about the Punisher, which I appreciate. The issue where Frank was on a bus at Christmas time I enjoyed. Were you mandated to write Christmas stories? I would think for Frank, those would be harder stories to come up with. Yeah, this is another example of Don's endless creativity. He's constantly coming up with different formats and ideas for the Punisher. I mean, there weren't, Captain America and Iron Man's editors weren't doing this. He was constantly coming up with one-shots and specials and graphic novels and blah, blah, blah. And he came up with this idea for the Punisher Holiday Special because it's darkly humorous. I mean, there's nothing Christmassy about the Punisher. But, so he would assign these Christmas stories or New Year's stories or whatever. And no, I like writing Christmas stories. I like the challenge of coming up with Christmas stories. So many classic stories that I like are set at Christmas. Shane Black is another writer who seems addicted to Christmas. Almost every one of Shane Black's movies takes place at Christmas time. So he's obviously got a thing for that. Now, this holiday special, the one here to the right, holiday special number 3, was this is a perfect example of Don Daley's editing style. I was visiting my buddy Flynn Henry, the previously mentioned Flynn Henry. I was visiting his apartment. We were hanging out, talking about stupid stuff while he drew comics. And the phone rings, and it's Don Daley. And I'm like, Don, how'd you find me here? You go, I called your wife, and she said this is where you were. And I said, okay, so what do you want? And Don's like all urgent, like this is an emergency, like he's in a burning building or something. He says, I have an artist here, and his wife just had a baby, and he really needs work. And could you write a story for him? And I said, yeah, I'll write him a story. Yeah, I'll let give me to the end of the week or whatever. And Don says, no, could you write a story right now? And I'm like, what, over the phone? And he goes, yeah. And I'm like, I can't write a story over the phone. And he says, oh, come on, you can do it. And the artist is sitting right here with me. So I said, okay, look, I'll tell you what. Call me back in 15 minutes and I'll have the opening pages to a story. And it was this holiday special number 3, the lead feature. So I sat down at Flint's kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote three or four pages. Don called back. I dictated the 3 or 4 pages to him. And Don says, oh, that's great. This will keep him busy for a couple of days. I said, yeah. And then, when I get home, I'll figure out where the rest of the story's going, and I'll have it done by the end of the week. And that was this holiday special. The artist was Dale Eaglesham, who was just starting out in the business. Tremendously talented guy, and he did this awesome cover, and he did an awesome job on the story itself. And it turned out to be one of my more popular Punisher stories, set at Christmas and all the rest. So it was fun stuff. But that was Don's style, and Don would come up with stuff like the Punisher Back to School special, which was not in the best of taste. And that's what I liked about Don. He was perfectly aware that this was kind of a tasteless project, in the light of things that were going on in the world. But he liked poking his thumb in the eye of tradition and status quo and all the rest of it. And he thought Punisher was like a perfect character. He really got like the darkly humorous aspect of the Punisher, almost parody aspect of the Punisher. And that's one of the reasons I liked working with him. He was totally fearless. This is also probably one of the reasons he got fired at Marvel shortly after this. But that's the way the guy worked. And I really dug working with him. And apparently he's a high school teacher now. Which I can't really feature, but I'm sure he's doing a great job at it because he was an earnest guy. He was just a lot of fun to work with. Another Don story before we go. I've told this one before, but it's worth telling again. He was briefly the editor on Savage Sword of Conan. And he was talking to me about different directions he wanted to go in. He wanted to use different artists and everything else. And he brought up an artist's name. And his assistant editor at the time was Tim Toohey. And Tim Toohey says, you can't use that artist. He says, and Don's like, why not? And he goes, well, he's in prison. He killed his wife with a hammer. And Don, not joking, this is what I mean by Don was funny when he was being serious. Absolutely not joking, totally earnest. Don said, damn, he would have been the perfect Conan artist. So that was Mr. Don Daley all over, all day long. Coach Savage, this is Dino Leto. Hey, Dino. It's my understanding you had the privilege of meeting Walter B. Gibson, the creator of The Shadow. The history books often talk about his proficiency in writing and how quickly he could turn out pulp novels. I do believe I remember you saying something about he had the ability to type so fast that he would actually burn out typewriters and had to move to one immediately next to the one he just broke to continue writing his stories. Could you expound upon that a little bit? I was at a comic book convention in New York City at the Statler Hilton Hotel. And this would probably have been 73, maybe 1970, 72 or 73. And Walter Gibson, who was a bit older than this drawing presents him, was at a panel moderated by Jim Steranko. And Jim, asked him questions. It was like a talk show format. And Mr. Gibson was very affable, very nice guy, very generous guy. And he described a lot about his work and how he came to write The Shadow and, the difficulties of writing 2 novels a month for years and all the rest of it. and just fascinating stuff. And yes, he would have a different room for each subject that he wrote about. He wrote on a lot of different subjects, science, magic, things like that. He's very, very extraordinarily prolific. I would argue he's probably the most prolific writer that ever lived. Constantly churning out books in addition to the shadow novels. And he would have, each room of his house was devoted to a different subject matter. He would have his research materials depending on what subject he was writing about. And in each room was a table with 3 typewriters on it. These were manual typewriters, back in the day. And he said that he would type so much that they would seize up. The lubricant, they would would congeal because of the heat of him typing. And he would just simply tear out that sheet of paper and move to the typewriter next to it. He also said that he typed so much that his fingertips would begin to bleed, and he would have to wrap bandages around them in order to not get blood all over the typewriter keys. That's a writer, baby. That is a writer. So anyway, at the end of this thing, the end of the panel discussion, Steranko opened it up to questions. And I was a young kid with a dream, wanted to be a writer, wanted to work in this arena, and I had a million questions. And being a young guy, tactless, I've probably some of the questions came across as rude. I didn't mean them to be. I just wanted answers. And it turned out like I was the guy. A couple of other guys asked about pulp stuff and things like that. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to know the writing process. This is the first professional writer I'd ever been in the same room with. And I could have talked to this guy all day and all night. And he was very, very nice about it. He received all of my questions, no matter how brusque or rude, with a great aplomb. And so I asked him about the writing process, this, that, and the other thing, the day-to-day stuff about writing, what was it like, how did you deal with deadlines? And the rudest question I asked him was, of all of the books you wrote, you had to have just hammered them out, simply hammered them out. You didn't have time to think about the nuances of plot and characterization and everything else. And I'm sure I put this, this question more bluntly than I'm paraphrasing it now. And I said, did you ever write a shadow novel you really liked, that you thought was actually a good novel? And he took the question well. I mean, that's kind of an insulting question to ask. But the reality is he couldn't have loved every novel he wrote. He was writing a novel every 14 days. And he did it for years. I mean, he was pounding these things out. And he said, yes. He said, the Romanov Jewels. He goes, if you ever get a chance to read it, and, I read it. It was in paperback. I went and got it. And yeah, it's a damn good book. All of his books are entertaining and engaging and briskly told and very well done. But the Romanov Jewels is exceptional of all of them. But that was, it was just awesome meeting a guy like that. I still can't believe I got to meet him and talk to him in that intimate a setting, because it was a small room. There was maybe like 100 people there. And he was so great. He was so great and gracious about answering the questions. So, Glenn Davis, recently you said the Wolfman was your favorite classic monster. Did you ever make a pitch for Werewolf by Night while at Marvel? What did you think of the mini cycle of werewolf movies, the late 70s, early 80s? The Howling, Wolfen, American Werewolf in London, The Beast Must Die, and maybe Curse of the Cat People. Are you working on a werewolf project? Yeah, Wolfman is my man. When I was a kid, I either wanted to be Batman or the Wolfman. And I thought Wolfman's cool because he's a monster and he scares everybody. But, he only works a few nights a week, a few nights a month. So most of the time you're yourself. But for a few nights, you give it over to the moon. And I thought that's pretty cool. And I just like the idea of it's weird that I wasn't scared by the Wolfman, that I saw him as a role model. I just thought he's just the coolest guy. And even in, I've said this before, even in the movies, Lawrence Talbot, I always thought Lawrence Talbot was such a great dresser. I literally wanted to meet his tailor. I just dug the way the guy, garbed himself in those, hip 40s clothes. My favorite movie of the group you mentioned is The Howling by far. I'm not a fan of the American Werewolf in London, like a lot of people are. I really like The Howling. It still holds up pretty good. I remember seeing it in a theater. It was a very frightening movie to see in a theater. Kind of overwhelming. Very, very dark werewolf flick. But seeing it recently, I realized, Joe Dante, the director, he just couldn't resist a gag. He kept putting in these like gags, these off, just visual gags and stuff like that, constantly reinforcing in the background, the theme of the movie. And I just, he does that in a lot of his movies where he'll make, pop cultural references or puns or whatever. And, seeing it again recently, it kind of takes away a little from the story, although it's still my favorite werewolf movie of that period. I never proposed a Werewolf by Night. Gary Quapis and I did propose a Shroud series, which would have had the Shroud in basically the Marvel monster universe. So we would have had Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, Werewolf by Night. They would have all been part of the Shroud series. But, we never got to do that. I talked about that in a video, maybe a month or so ago. I have done some werewolf stuff, though. I did a series that I don't think was ever completed called Big Bads. It was a series brought to me and assigned to me, basically. And it was werewolves in an urban setting, sort of a hip-hop setting. Think New Jack City meets The Howling. And it was about werewolves plaguing a city housing project in the middle of winter, in the middle of an electrical outage. And basically gangbangers versus werewolves. Another werewolf project I did for Zenescope, I did a Van Helsing miniseries, which is available in trade, with the very, very simple and elegant title, Van Helsing versus the Werewolf. Now, I have a werewolf story in mind that I would like to do, and I've been talking for years with an artist who is currently under exclusive contract with Marvel. But for years, we've talked about this project, and I don't want to tell you the high concept of it because somebody will steal it. But he promises me that as soon as he ends his exclusive arrangement with Marvel, he and I will work on this. And I won't tell you his name, so you won't be pestering him at conventions. But we definitely see this in our future, and I've got the whole plot in my head, and it would be set in a certain historical period, and it would be set during wintertime because I love werewolf stories set in wintertime. Okay, when Bane was locked up in solitary for his entire early life, was he just being fed? Was he still being fed? I would assume so. My take was that the warden wanted the young Bane to lose the will to live rather than die of starvation. We see Bane catching fish and killing rats. Am I correct in assuming this was extra protein would supplement the bread and gruel slid under his door? Surely starving a kid to death would be too far even for Penadora. At the very least, he must have been given fresh water to drink, so surely he'd be given a meager prison meal as well. Yeah, I mean, when he was in solitary, I'm sure they supplemented his diet of rats and fish. But I mean, he was left in solitary to either break him or to die. These are... it certainly didn't put him in solitary to protect him from the rest of the prison population. I always like to think that they put him in solitary to protect the rest of the prison population from him. Even though he was a kid, he killed a man, before he'd, reached the age of 10. So he was obviously a dangerous individual and unpredictable, and they wanted to lock him away. Basically, those scenes were to show, how horrible his life was. the environment that created the monster that would become Bane. And some of those conditions I got from the book Papillon, which is the true story of a French prisoner held in French penal colonies like Devil's Island and colonies on the mainland Venezuela, once French Guiana. And, so a lot of it was inspired by those things, by actual conditions at those prisons. As horrifying as it may seem, I didn't really make anything up. And I thought that these same conditions would prevail at Penudora, since it was such a god-awful hellhole of a place. Good advice, kids. Don't get put in prison overseas. Don't get put in prison anywhere. They're not fun here in the United States either, but overseas, man, you are, it's not good. It is not good. Human rights are not something they consider. So, yeah, I mean, it was the deprivations and horrifying conditions were all to basically build the character that we know and love today as Bane. Hey, if you want to reach me with questions, pictures of your cats, dogs, suggestions, whatever, it's brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com is the best, most reliable way to reach me. And think about going to Discord, spinrack.io at Discord. We got a nice little community growing there. We've got tryout scripts that I wrote especially for any of you wannabe artists to try your hand, pencilers, inkers, letterers, colorists. We've had some terrific submissions. We've had people showing us their very own work. We've had art teams come together, writers looking for artists and artists looking for writers, and they've actually come together at Discord. So it's a great place, and Graham and I are there, and we're offering our sage advice and guidance. It's not really mentoring, but we'll tell you what we think of your work and give you a few pointers on how to make it better, how to improve, and how to help yourself find a career in comics if that's what you're looking for. It's all at spinrack.io at Discord. And I want to thank all of you for listening, watching, liking, subscribing. Our numbers are growing here. This little channel is becoming more and more popular, especially over the last few months. And I appreciate all of that. And I will see every one of you down the road.